If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. I'm an author and a public historian. Thomas Wise was well respected among the rare book fanatics of 1930s London as a consummate collector, but when Wise began to uncover a frankly surprising amount of valuable first editions in mint condition, things started to look a little fishy. Look, I collected first editions for a long time, modern first editions, Fleming, Orwell, Tolkien, J.K. Rowling, and there are always the tells that you look for in a first edition when you first pick up the book. For instance, one of the most collectible first editions, which I happened to have a copy of, not anymore, was Casino Royale by Ian Fleming, published in 1953. And it's a must for any modern edition or Fleming collector because it's the first book in the James Bond series. And it's the one in most demand. Interestingly, the dust jacket was designed by Ian Fleming himself, and it's a stonker. It's amazingly beautiful. So what you need to know about that particular book. 4,728 copies of the first impression were printed, although no more than 3,000 were issued in the first state dust wrapper. The remaining have I guess you'd call it a favorable Sunday Times review, kind of overprinted on the front flap. To have a first edition, a first impression of the text with a first issue of the dust jacket is a notorious rarity and an incredibly strong investment piece. I'm thinking I paid maybe about $3,000 or $4,000 for that copy, quite a lot of money, and it really was the prince of my collection. And if I still had it now, it would be worth at least $150,000 if only I'd kept it. So that book is published by Jonathan Cape, and the copyright page will list the year of publication as 1953, as I mentioned. There's nothing really to look for in that particular book apart from that. However, if you come to Moonraker, which was number 3 in the James Bond series, that's actually considered by many to be Fleming's finest book. And the first edition of Moonraker is highly sought after on the market. And copies of the first issue, like I said, are notoriously rare. Moonraker first edition points. The first state of the text, state A, has a spelling mistake on page 10, line 31. And it has shoe, S-H-O-O, for shoot. The T is actually missing, and that's really important. The first state dust jacket is by an incredible artist called Kenneth Lewis, and it's this amazing flame design. And on the front flap, it actually has listed Casino Royale on the rear panel. The rear flap is actually blank, and the price is shown at 10 shillings and 6 pence. Or, if you're not familiar with that, 10 shillings 6D. That book is also published by Jonathan Cape in London, and the copyright page will actually list the year of publication as 1955. Right now, first state examples of that book range from around £20,000 to £30,000 in fine condition, down to between, maybe £5,000 to £20,000 in good to near fine condition. Signed examples, of which I have to say, I don't know why I do it because I'm just beating myself up. I had a signed example. They're notoriously scarce of this particular title, and they sell for about £60,000. For me, there's nothing better than holding a book that Fleming has actually signed. There is an invisible essence to the man that's then left in that book, and it's special. And I think what's really interesting about first editions is that most first edition buyers, once you've felt the book and you've opened the book and you've looked at it and you've felt its pages, you smell the book. There's a smell that comes with these old books, and it's unmistakable. You can't forge that smell. If you know all of the above, wouldn't forging a new old edition be easy? Joseph Horn is the author of a new book called The Book Forger. It's fabulous, which transports readers back to a crime caper in the eccentric book world of 1930s London book collecting. They're strange now. Oh my God, collectors were weirder even then. So the story that I want to discuss with you today covers what's covered in Joseph Horn's new book. But one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it, because it's a story that's as valid today, maybe more so with so many countries, kind of faking antiques. And yes, books are also being faked as well. So let me take you back to that world and paint you a lively, vivid picture of it for you. So in the 20th century, people will go wild for rare old books. It's kind of very much tied up in the culture of the US in particular, because there's robber barons there and they're looking for old world culture to spend their new world money on. People like John Pierpont Morgan, Henry Huntington, they're spending vast amount of money on very old books to get hold of these old first editions, Shakespeare playbooks, but not just old books. They start to buy new books too. And there is this kind of cast in London of these amazing, eccentric characters who are actually selling the books. But there's also a brilliant book published at the time called Anatomy of Bibliomania by a guy called Holbrook Jackson. And he makes a point that all bibliomaniacs, all bibliophiles, are, when it boils down to it, perverts for books. And I know that's a really strange thing to say, but if you're a book lover, you'll understand exactly what I mean. And that's the kind of world that we're now in. We're in the world of the grand halls of Oxford, the dusty corners of London bookshops of the 1930s, this strange world of libraries who really have no idea, what they have in their possessions, and of course the people who inhabit them. And at the center of this story, we have an incredibly rare book collector called Thomas James Wise. Never heard of him? I'm not surprised. But he was a big deal. He was certainly a big book collecting deal in the 1930s. And what kind of man you think Thomas Wise is rather depends on the context in which you meet him. For people who admire him, he is the pinnacle of the rare book world. He has assembled in his house in Hampstead the greatest private library in the kingdom. People joke that only the most perfect books are allowed into Thomas Wise's library. They have to be physically flawless. They have to look exactly as they did on the day that they came off the press, no matter how old they are. And Wise has this uncanny ability to sniff out the most perfect copies. And yet, for the younger generation who are coming up in this book world, Wise is something of a dinosaur. He's pompous, he's a little bit fearsome, he's quick to hand down judgments. Things he doesn't like, he sort of smacks down and says, that's not worth a penny. He is a sort of, I guess you'd describe him as Zeus on top of the Mount Olympus of the book world. Whether or not you get on his good side is, well, it's ultimately up to the toss of a coin. He's quite an unlikable character in many ways, I would say. But something also that's interesting about him is that he's swimming in quite an elite world. And he doesn't have the same background as a lot of the people in that world. And when I say the book world is elite, it absolutely is. These are aristocrats who have been handed down libraries that are worth an absolute fortune, where books are actually worth their weight in gold. But Wise actually comes from a lower working class family in North London. He doesn't go to school. He doesn't go to university. He's sent to work in a trading office or a stock jobber's office when he's 12 years old. And it's really the experience of buying books on street market corners and bartering and trading in places like Petticoat Lane that kind of gets him into this world. So even when he's a teenager, he's kind of lurking around the corners. He's interested in books. He's a bibliophile for sure. And keep in mind, this is still the time where you have glamorous figures from the Victorian world of literature roaming the streets of London as well. You've got Oscar Wilde moving around in London and in Paris. You've got Rudyard Kipling. You've got H.G. Wells. You've got Aldous Huxley. All these people are still there. And Wise is a kind of a young whippersnapper trying to get into this literary world. And he does it really by becoming an expert on modern first editions. And this is actually something that Wise invents. Before Wise comes along, everybody wants old books. They want 200, 300, 400, 500-year-old books. You know, the old kind of dusty tomes that sit on Oxbridge College library shelves. But Wise is the person who actually says, oh no, I actually want the perfect modern first edition. These have value. These will have value. And he kind of invents this idea of the first edition, really just because he can't afford old books. But it turns out he's a tastemaker and he's ahead of the game. He's thinking light years ahead. So he really gets to kind of shape the kind of books that people want, including all those wealthy American collectors who are coming up through the markets, the robber barons that I spoke of. And by the time Wise is in his 30s, he's actually sitting pretty on his throne, and they all want his modern first editions. But he's not only a collector and seller of books, he's also one of the first, if not the first, forger of modern first editions. So how did he get into the forgery game? Some of the books that Wise is dealing with turn out to be a little bit dodgy. Effectively, what Wise starts doing, he kind of gets involved in an organization called the Shelley Society. It's founded really as a kind of celebration of the writings of Percy Shelley. And Shelley's early writings are very, very, very difficult to get hold of. And Wise says to the committee of this society, look, why don't I take some of your copies and some of my copies, and we'll make nice duplicates of them for the society members. And look, we'll print off a few hundred, we'll hand them out to the members, and everybody will be happy that they've actually got something that looks the part, but isn't quite the part. And the society thinks this is an absolutely fabulous idea, and they agree immediately. And they do look the part. You know, he actually puts a little essay just inside the front flap, and it's all made to look kind of legitimate. But at some point, Wise actually starts saying to himself, well, maybe I could actually print off 1 or 2 more of these copies. Maybe I could even print 10 or 12 more and actually start passing them off and circulating them within certain bookshops without actually saying that they're facsimiles. And that's what he starts to do. And then he picks up on a really ingenious idea. The idea that really does set him apart from any other rare book forger, because he realizes that if you put these things side by side, you're always going to be able to tell that one's not the same as the other. You know, it might be the feel of the paper. It might be the size of the type. It could be, you know, all kinds of tiny little things like that. Just these little tiny giveaway details. The kind of things that, you know, the kind of things that Sherlock Holmes would pick up on. And he decides that maybe he could start inventing first editions, which is a totally wild idea. But what he does is he takes a famous poem by Shelley, first of all by Shelley, but then he branches into Tennyson or Browning, you know, or one of these other Victorian luminaries, and he reprints it in a little pamphlet. And what he then does, he puts an earlier date on the pamphlet from the pre-existing first edition. So he makes a kind of pre-first edition that antedates, you know, the real first edition. It's genius. And then, even more genius, he discovers them. He will announce to the world that while going through a cache of papers or while going through an anonymous lot at an auction, he found this book that nobody knew existed before, or he finds this pamphlet that nobody knew existed before. And, you know, the first thing is it really cements Wise's place at the pinnacle of the book world because he's finding these things. No one else is finding these things, but he is. Well, in actual fact, he's not. He says he's finding these things, but he's forging these things. So this young whippersnapper who has come from nowhere, all of a sudden he's finding books and very rare pamphlets that nobody knew existed. There's no record of them. And this really helps build his fame and reputation in the field. At the same time, it also means that he's got this whole cache of these things that he can just quietly unload to wealthy collectors for massive premiums without anybody asking any questions, because Wise is the one who's authenticated it. He's the one who's discovered it. So there is no point of reference apart from him. I then wondered what was his motivation in doing these forgeries. Was it to cement his reputation, or was there also financial motivation and that he was getting rich off this? And the conclusion that I came to was that it was both. He was getting incredibly wealthy. And I think 100% money is the main driver at this stage, because he's not a wealthy man, but he does become a very wealthy man. And the remarkable thing is, he's obviously incredibly good in the business world. You know, he actually starts at this stock jobbing company as a junior clerk, you know, in an office that trades commodities and colonial goods. He eventually becomes the City of London's main trader of lavender. Isn't that interesting? So he's a smart guy, and he works his way up in this kind of commodities world to really quite startling heights, because this wasn't a world where you just came in and made your money if you didn't have family money behind you. So he's obviously incredibly good at what he does. But all this while, he's actually earning large sums of money offloading fakes into unsuspecting collectors' hands. And when you look at his letters as well, they're so ingeniously devious is the only word that really comes to mind. He will say, you know, I've just found another copy. And this is a letter that he might be writing to, you know, one of these Carnegies of the world. I've just found another copy. There's only my copy and this copy that I've found. That's it. You'll not find any other collector who's got one. You should buy this. And of course they do. And of course, what he's doing is actually writing to 4 or 5 very wealthy private collectors at the same time. And as time goes on, he really gets quite brazen. You know, he starts selling 5 or 6 or 7 of the same facsimile copy to various book collectors. And of course, these various book collectors are incredibly secretive. They don't talk about the books that they're buying. And this is what allows him to get away with what he's doing. If he'd been selling them to book shops, then red flags would have been going off, but they weren't, which means that the collectors believe him, that they're not telling anyone about their secret purchases. It actually strikes me that he's set himself up incredibly well. You know, he started collecting modern books and modern first editions because he simply couldn't afford to collect the older books. He didn't have the money. But also, thinking about it, modern books are easier to forge, aren't they? You know, the process of forging. You know, if you want to try and forge, say, a Shakespeare first folio, right? And they're like hen's teeth. I mean, there are several things that are going to be difficult. The first thing is sourcing the right paper, getting the right type, and then aging the paper to make it look like it was 400 years old. You know, this isn't just a case of getting your tea bag and you know, kind of pushing the tea bag across the paper as you would, you know, if you were making a treasure map or something. You know, there's all kinds of smoking and aging in that paper process that needs to be involved. There's sunlight, there's spotting. You know, it's actually a long process to create an illusion of that age. Wise decided very early on that he was never going to do that. He wasn't going to go in that direction. And instead, he was going to forge these modern first editions where the printing technology to make them was exactly the same as the first editions, as the actual technology would have been used, you know, 40, 50, 60, even 70 years earlier. Also, because Wise created this fashion for impeccably clean books, as a collector, he would only buy impeccably clean books. Because he was a tastemaker, the idea that they were sort of suspiciously clean didn't seem to come up, because, you know, that's the kind of thing that people were looking for at the time, because Wise was running that market. He was the one who was telling everyone that you don't want a dirty book. You want the cleanest book that you can possibly find. And they're out there to be found. Look at this. I've just found one. He's a genius. And indeed, when he makes his money, he does start to get interested in those more expensive, older books by the contemporaries of Shakespeare, even Shakespeare's folio. He had a first folio of Shakespeare, which is, as I said, it's rarer than hen's teeth to find. But what he does when he finds these older books, by the contemporaries, he actually takes them to a restorer. So let's say a book is 300 years old and it's damaged and it might be missing part of its pages, all of the above. It's got spotting, etc. Wise actually takes them to a restorer who will actually chemically bleach the pages free of any dirt, free of any scribbles that the readers might have made when they were reading those books. Any tears that they have are expertly repaired. If the binding is loose, it's immediately repaired to look like new. And the pages, for instance, if the pages had been trimmed down, these restorers would add extra paper, proper aged paper around the edges of those pages to make them look whole, to effectively make these old books look new. And it's a really weird thought process, but there's madness behind what he's doing, because what he would do is take a book that's 400 years old and make it look like it was only 40 years old. So he became the market, and suddenly that became the market that everybody wanted. And it's just thinking about it now, it's just a weird thing to do with old books. Not back then, because he was the market maker. As for the manufacturing of the forgeries, he had an inside man at a printing firm. Case was the guy's name, who really had been with him since the early days of printing those legitimate facsimiles before he decided to go rogue. And so it was really just a case of maintaining that relationship and saying, well, you know what, Case, it's just another facsimile. It's fine. It's legit. I'm not on selling it. It's just for me. It's for my collection. It's just in case the original goes astray. Don't worry about it. And even if suspicions were raised, you would assume that there would, of course, been backhanders. And I'm sure all of that was going on. Although there's no proof of that. We actually have no proof of it, but you can absolutely understand what he's doing. Or it may simply be the case that Wise spent so much money with the printing company that they didn't want to upset the apple cart. And by this stage, Wise was incredibly famous across the globe. So here he is, he's creating his forgeries, he's selling them on to wealthy clients, but two men come along that might just burst his bubble. One called Carter and the other one is called Pollard, and they're also book collectors. These guys are somewhat of an unlikely pairing. I actually like both of them. I mean, this is really why I got into this story, because Carter and Pollard, they just fascinated me. They're one of the weirdest double acts of the early 20th century book world. I just love them. Carter is this kind of, patrician. He went to Eton. He then went to Cambridge. People talk about him as being the most elegant man they've ever met. And, he eventually marries this fashion correspondent, for the Sunday Times, who's incredibly elegant, and she chums with, people like Ian Fleming. And his first ever published pamphlet is called The Dry Martini. And that's the kind of guy who Carter is. He's a very upstanding kind of fellow. Pollard, on the other hand, is the kind of bohemian Soho figure who also went to Oxford but drops out. He's a member of the Communist Party because it's kind of cool to be a member of the Communist Party, and he's kind of notorious at Oxford for wearing, get this, corduroy trousers. I know. Now, it's difficult to try and imagine yourself in a world, considering the world that we live in, where wearing corduroy trousers at Oxford is radical, but it absolutely was. It's amazing. And it was quite shocking. So that's Pollard. And Carter and Pollard, well, they actually both end up after university going into the book world in London, selling old books. And, they're members of this little kind of known book club in London. And I say club, but it's actually less cliquey than it actually sounds. It's more kind of like, I don't know, a group of young, like-minded booksellers. Nerds. They're nerds. They're the nerds of today. They effectively like to get together once a week and they'd have a drink in a pub and they would just talk about books. I mean, you can't get more nerdy than that. And they would also then, talk about the rumors that were going around. They would talk about the new books that were coming out. They would talk about Wise in very revered and worshipful tones because he was top of the book collecting world. And they're all part of this Bloomsbury, kind of set of figures that are kind of dashing about the streets of London at this particular stage. But it's Pollard who starts to get suspicious of some of the books that come on the market. And what he notices about them, first off, is that they're just too clean. And Pollard wonders how they keep appearing. If there's only supposed to be 3 or 4 of them in the entire world, how do they constantly keep appearing at auction houses? It makes no sense. And so they decide they're going to look into it. And I think the reason why they decide to get into it, and it's something that I think about a lot, is that in the 1930s readers are actually obsessed with detective fiction. Everybody's, this is the golden age of the detective story. Everybody's reading, Agatha Christie. She's huge. Dorothy Sayers, Donald Knox, they're just devouring this stuff. And I think it's that era that kind of wormed its way into their brains. And they decide they're going to look into these books the same way that someone like Sherlock Holmes would. They're going to take it on board and find out what the heck's going on. So if you want to be the Sherlock Holmes or the Hercule Poirot of the book world, you then have to wonder, how do you begin unpicking the story of these forgeries? Where do you start? How do you prove basically that they're forgeries in the first place? It's fine having the intuition to say that these books aren't real, but what do you then do? And the thing is, a bit like Wise inventing these first editions, inventing this first edition market, and then forging first editions, no one has ever really looked into forging new books. It's never happened because the forging of new books has never happened before. People have done it with older books, looking at kind of Shakespearean quartos and, datings and false dates and, and doing the same with very academic works and looking at books that are, 400 years old. No one's done it with modern first editions. So where do you start? So if the technology was all correct, which for the most part it was, spoiler, there were a couple of little things. How can you actually detect that? Well, one way, and it's a way that Sherlock Holmes actually talks about, believe it or not, in The Hound of the Baskervilles, he actually talks about the detection of typefaces, one of the most elementary branches of detection. And that's exactly how Holmes describes it. He says, look at the typefaces. And so they start looking at the typeface of the prints of several books that they think have been forged, all of which were supposed to be printed at very different times in different places. And if they look, they're actually printed in the same typeface. And that to them immediately looks a bit fishy. But look into it even more. And there were certain shapes to certain letters that simply could not have existed if the books had been printed at the date that was on their title page. Look, there's something, for those of you, I'm also in the publishing business, so I know this business quite well. There's also something in that business, in my business, called a kern in typefaces. In typography, a kern refers to the adjustment of the space between characters in a font to achieve a visually pleasing and readable text. Kerning actually involves adjusting the spacing between the individual letters to correct spacing issues. And I suppose what it does is it improves the overall appearance of the text. And kerns actually existed on all lowercase f's. It's the bit that, I don't know, it kind of dangles out over the letter that comes next. And that existed in old typefaces, really right through up until about the 1880s. Whether the arch of the F kind of dangles over, that little bit dangles over quite far, that's the kern sort of slots and how it slots into the next letter of the 1880s. You get these industrialized kind of printing presses, and the F is so delicate that it actually, there's so much pressure that's created on these kerns that the F starts snapping off. So someone comes along and effectively says, well, that's not good. So we need to modify the F that it doesn't have so much of an arch, so that it just kind of goes up and stops. And lo and behold, these books that were supposedly printed in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s had kernless Fs. I know. It's a bit nerdy, but this is what happened. And this is how they started to find this kind of stuff out. So what they're now looking at is books that were printed back then, and they're actually saying to themselves, there's no way that could exist. So that's one piece of evidence that they suddenly have. It was that kind of Sherlock Holmesian evidence that they'd found, the smoking gun. But there was another smoking barrel, and that was the paper. And paper we think of today, we think of paper as just being paper. And what possible difference could there be? But paper today is made from wood pulp. And that's a recent thing. If you look at a book that was made in the 1860s or even earlier, it was primarily composed of rags, old rags, cloth rags that were used to make paper. And they used like linen rags and cotton rags. And the paper of then is much more sturdy than the modern paper today. But that was actually the primary material. And that went into the manufacturing of paper. Again, it's in the 1870s, 1860s. But then, all of a sudden, because there are so many books being published at this time, primarily because books were becoming less expensive and the ordinary man in the street was buying them, there's a shortage of rags. There's a rag shortage. So people are trying to, especially newspaper giants, these newspaper proprietors, they're actually going out to inventors and saying, can somebody please invent a new way of making paper? And some ingenious person comes up along and says, well, how about wood pulp? But before they get there, they actually say Sparta grass. And they recommend Sparta grass because it's almost like papyrus. And you know what? If it worked for the Egyptians, then maybe it can work for us. But it's actually really horrible stuff. It's very brittle. It falls apart. And of course, then someone says, well, how about wood pulp? And lo and behold, all these forgeries are not made of Sparta grass. They're made from wood pulp, chemical wood pulp. And they can't be. It wasn't invented when the books were actually being printed. And this is another anchorism. So Carter and Pollard have taken this Sherlock Holmes-style approach to the physical being of these books. They knew they were fake, or they had this feeling that they were fake, and they just needed to work out who had done it. It's fascinating stuff. And, any of you out there who think you might have found a Browning First Edition in a charity shop, check out the Kerns. So they've found all this information out, but how do they take it back and expose Wise? Because he's this incredibly famous man. I mean, it's astonishing, really. Wise is, of course, he's at that pinnacle of fame. He's untouchable in many ways. And by this point, he's actually been given honorary degrees from Oxford and Cambridge. He's one of the trustees of the British Museum. He's the past president of the Bibliophiles Society, which is the scholarly society for the study of old books. So how on earth can they possibly point the finger at Wise? Well, there are three things that give him away. One is that Wise has a trusted bookseller, an antiquarian bookseller by the name of Herbert Gorfin, who actually worked with Wise in his stock jobbing trading company in the city. And Wise has trusted this guy Gorfin with selling a lot of books, a lot of original books. He basically sold huge numbers. Then Wise goes to him and says, hey, I'm finding all these new first editions. You can make yourself a bit of money. Why don't you buy them from me and then on-sell them to your clients, which Gorfin does. He has no clue that Wise is now giving him forgeries. So Gorfin does this, and at this time that, Carter and Pollard are kind of going through all these old auction catalogs, trying to trace the provenance back to the owners of the books, a pattern emerges. And what they see is that all the roads seem to lead back to Herbert Gorfin. So they go to him and he says, well, look, I bought all these books from Thomas Wise. And not only did I buy the books from him, I can prove it because I've got all my receipts. He has no idea. Always keep your business receipts, guys. So the second thing that led them to Wise is that Wise is said to have discovered all these books and then given them to Gorfin to sell. So what we now know is that Wise has actually been part of the whole racket from the start. And, Wise has been doing this based on his reputation and his skill and his tenacity as a book hunter. Because remember, Wise is saying he's finding all these things when nobody else can. So if Wise is the person who keeps discovering them and they discover that what Gorfin is selling are fakes, it's kind of difficult not to go directly to Wise. He is the last man in the line. And the third road that leads to Wise is the printer, Clay. Now Carter and Pollard can trace this particular font to this particular printer. So they then go to Clay, and Clay says, look, all our business records, all of the things that you're requesting, guess what? They were incinerated some time ago. I mean, that alone also sets them on edge because it just doesn't happen. There are too many things pointing to Wise. Wise is obviously the last man in the line. The printer suddenly says, oh yeah, we don't have any records. I mean, it again just adds to their theory that Wise is the man behind all of this. What Clay does admit to, though, is he says that Thomas Wise constantly asks for facsimile copies. And what he says is, you know what, perhaps you should go speak to him. So that's exactly what Pollard does. He heads off to Wise's house in Hampstead and he says, look, we've got all this evidence against you. But he doesn't mention Gorfin. He deliberately doesn't mention Gorfin. And then he and Carter go for a drink in the pub and they wait. And what they're thinking is, well, what's Wise going to do? What would he do if he did actually forge all this stuff? What would be his next move? And they figure out that what he's going to try and do is silence anyone who can pin it on him. So he's going to go to Gorfin and he's also going to go to Clay. And that same night, they actually get a message from Gorfin saying, oh my God, Wise has got in touch with me. What do I do? What do I say? And so in a way, they kind of smoke him out and they write this expose going into the chemical analysis of the paper. They talk about the kerns. They talk about the design of the fonts, and they constantly kind of circle back to Wise without ever quite accusing him. But there is this sense that he's the one that's behind it all. And because they don't want to get into a thorny legal battle, but it's also fairly obvious when you read what they've written, which is actually published in one of the papers, who it leads back to. And of course, their paper comes out and the reviewer says that there's only one man who smells like brimstone. And yep, it's pretty easy to see who that man is. And Wise is named and shamed. The reputational damage is very quick and it's very hard. Wise is pretty much one of the very few commoner members of a book club called the Roxburgh Club. And this is the premier book collecting society in the world, even to this day. This is the most hoity-toity of book collecting circles in the world. Its founding members include George John, 2nd Earl Spencer, George Granville Gower, 2nd Duke of Sutherland, Sir William Bollard. They're all aristocrats who have inherited these amazing libraries. And they set this very exclusive book club up, which they've invited Wise to join. And he's not one of them, but his reputation has preceded him. He's a self-made man, and being admitted into a club like this is the biggest feather in his cap that he can imagine. Anyway, the Roxburgh Club actually calls an extraordinary meeting to discuss what should be done with Wise. And the long and the short is that Wise is thrown out of the Roxburgh Club. At this stage, he's also in his mid-70s, and people are we're talking about books, but people are actually kind of very reluctant to hit him too hard with legal suits, as it were, because in his older age, he became a likable fellow. Wise, however, takes it very badly, and he literally dies 2 years after the inquiry comes out. The gossip on the street is always that it was the shame of it all that really kind of killed him. And even when he was on his deathbed, he was asked by a very close friend to effectively just come clean. It's like, wise old chap, get it off your chest. Just admit what you did. And Wise's last words were, "It's all too complicated to go into now." And with that, he dies. He never confessed. I think secretly, Wise, in not so nice a way, had kind of pushed the blame onto other people. He died in disgrace, and that's where his reputation stayed. Interestingly, today, some people actively collect Wise forgeries, and some forgeries are more valuable than the originals. The whole romance of Wise and his story and publishing and forging pamphlets and books is what actually pushes the prices of these pamphlets up now. They're just hugely valuable. But if you're scooping through the barrows of Charing Cross Road, or going through a secondhand bookshop in Bloomsbury, or you're on the Seine and you're finding these antique booksellers, every now and again you can actually pick up a Wise major forgery. And certainly his facsimile editions, some of those kind of pop up rather regularly. Some of his little pirated kind of pamphlets, they turn up, every now and again. And they're actually really good finds, when you do come across them. They're actually worthwhile searching for, because the joy isn't so much in the finding, it's in the searching. On that note, folks, thanks for listening in. Bye for now.